Catherine Ashmore pressed her back against the corridor wall and held her breath so hard her ribs hurt. Through the half-open door she had seen everything. Octavia Bowmont's fingers were laced through Reginald Lockxley's. Their bodies stood too near for innocence. Their voices were low and hungry, their laughter careless as spilled wine. And then Octavia, in that honey-soft voice all Virginia admired, said of Edmund Harwell the one word Catherine could never unknow: useful. For one terrible second, Catherine saw the whole future in it. Edmund, standing at an altar believing himself chosen. A marriage rotting from the inside while society toasted its elegance. A good man made into a convenience by a beautiful liar. Catherine could still walk away. She could smooth her gloves, return to the ballroom, stand near the wall where she had spent 28 years learning to disappear, and pretend she had seen nothing at all. But Edmund Harwell, the most honorable man in Virginia, was standing 20 feet away, trusting a woman already planning to destroy him. Catherine could not walk away. If this story already has your heart, subscribe to the channel, stay with me to the very end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story travels. The summer of 1815 was the hottest Virginia had seen in a decade, and the Ashworth estate was doing its best to pretend otherwise. Candles burned in every sconce. Silk fans snapped open and shut like restless birds. Laughter rang bright and deliberate, the kind people performed when they wished to be seen performing it. Beneath it all ran the steady current of judgment, as old and natural to Virginia society as tobacco, inheritance, and other people's ruin. Catherine stood near the far end of the ballroom and tried to take up as little space as possible. She was very good at that. Her younger sister, Harriet, appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses of lemonade and the cheerful ruthlessness only younger sisters possess. "You're doing it again," Harriet said, "standing against the wall like you hope it will swallow you." "I'm perfectly comfortable." "You look like you're attending a funeral." "Perhaps I am." Harriet pressed a glass into her hand. "Mama is watching. Smile at something." Catherine smiled at the nearest flower arrangement. It did not help. Their mother, Dorothea Ashmore, was indeed watching from across the room with the concentrated attention of a woman who had invested heavily in the evening and expected a return. She had spent 3 weeks reminding Catherine that Edmund Harwell's engagement ball was the social event of the season, that half of Virginia's finest families would be present, and that Catherine was 28 and still unmarried, which Dorothea described not as a fact, but as a personal affliction. Catherine had listened to all of it with the patience of long practice, nodded at the proper moments, and decided privately that if she survived the evening without humiliating anyone, the night would count as a success. She had not expected survival to require courage. That came later, when she slipped into the side corridor to powder her nose and heard voices behind a door not fully shut. She should have kept walking. "You worry too much," a man's voice said, low and amused. "He suspects nothing." "He suspects nothing yet." Octavia's voice. Catherine knew it the way she knew birdsong, without invitation and without wanting to. Octavia had a voice like warm honey and a laugh that made every man in a room tilt toward her like flowers toward light. "But if you're seen leaving with me tonight," Reginald began, "then we'll be careful." "We are always careful, Reginald." A pause. The soft sound of fabric shifting, the kind of sound that told its own story. "After the wedding it will be easier," Octavia said. "Edmund will be occupied with his estates, his business, all the things that occupy men like him. We'll have plenty of time." "And in the meantime?" "In the meantime," Octavia said, her voice lowering into something that turned Catherine's stomach cold, "he remains exactly what he is. Useful." Catherine stood absolutely still. She heard Reginald laugh, the sound of a man who had never been told no by anyone who mattered to him. And then the rustle of movement as they prepared to return to the party. Catherine pressed herself flat to the wall and breathed through her mouth until their footsteps faded. Then she stood alone in the corridor with a truth she had never asked to carry. "Walk away," said the sensible part of her mind. "This is not your affair. You are nobody in this house. You will not be believed. You will be laughed at, or worse. Octavia Bowmont will make your life a misery, and your mother will never forgive you." But Edmund Harwell's face rose in her mind. Not the formal face he wore in public, but the one she had glimpsed by accident on two separate occasions. Once, when his horse had thrown a shoe outside her father's gate, and he had laughed at himself with genuine ease. Once, when he had knelt in the street to help a child gather fallen apples, as though kindness were the most natural thing in the world. He was a good man. A good man deserved to know. So Catherine smoothed her skirts, lifted her chin, and walked back into the ballroom. Finding Edmund Harwell was not difficult. He was the tallest man in the room and carried himself with the easy authority of someone who had never had to fight for the space he occupied. He stood near the doors to the garden, speaking with two gentlemen while Octavia laughed at his side, radiant, one hand resting lightly on his sleeve. Catherine's nerve nearly failed her then and there. "He will not believe you," said her mind. "He has to have the chance," said something older and more stubborn within her. She waited. She watched. She told herself she was merely choosing her moment, though she knew perfectly well that waiting long enough would become its own choice. At last, Octavia was drawn away by another woman, and the two gentlemen drifted toward the card tables. For one brief, improbable moment, Edmund Harwell stood alone. Catherine walked toward him before she could think herself out of it. He noticed her when she was still several feet away, not because she was remarkable, Catherine knew she was not, but because he was the kind of man who noticed things. "Good evening, miss," he said with quiet courtesy. "I don't believe we've been formally introduced." "We haven't. My name is Catherine Ashmore. My father is James Ashmore. He has the property on the Eastern Road." "Miss Ashmore." He inclined his head. "Are you enjoying the evening?" "Mr. Harwell," she said, keeping her voice low, looking him directly in the eye because she knew she would not be able to do this twice. "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear it before you decide whether to believe it. I was in the South Corridor not 20 minutes ago, and I heard your fiancé and Reginald Lockxley together. They spoke of an arrangement between them, one that will continue after your marriage. She called you useful." The silence that followed was the longest of Catherine's life. Edmund's expression did not change. That frightened her more than anger would have. He looked as though he were making some decision behind his eyes that she could not see. "That is a serious accusation," he said at last. "Yes, sir. I know it is. You understand what it means for a woman of your position to make such a claim against a woman of Miss Beaumont's standing?" "I understand it perfectly." She clasped her hands so tightly her knuckles ached. "I am not saying it for my sake. I have nothing to gain from this. I am saying it because it is the truth." He studied her. Not the way most men looked through her to something more interesting beyond, but with a searching directness that made her feel both seen and terrified. "You are quite certain of what you heard?" "I am." Another silence. He glanced once toward the far side of the room where Octavia had reappeared near the fireplace. His jaw tightened barely at all. "Miss Ashmore," he said carefully, "I appreciate your candor. I will think on what you've said." It was a dismissal, a gracious one, but a dismissal nonetheless. Catherine nodded, stepped back, thanked him for hearing her, and made herself walk away slowly without looking back. An hour later, she stood at the edge of the garden, needing air and the kind of silence only outdoors could provide, when footsteps sounded behind her on the stone path. She turned and found Edmund Harwell no longer wearing his easy social expression. "Miss Ashmore," he said, "tell me again, everything you heard. Leave nothing out." So she told him, exactly, steadily, without embellishment and without mercy. When she finished, he was silent a long time. "Lockxley," he said at last, the name flat and cold. "Yes, sir. They used it, clearly. She used it twice." Something moved across his face and was controlled almost immediately. "You'd never met me before tonight." "No, sir." "You had no reason to approach me." "Every reason not to." "That is correct." "Then why?" He looked at her properly then, and Catherine had the startling feeling that she was the only thing in his field of vision. "You know what she could do to your family's standing," he said. "You know what society would say. That you're a plain woman inventing scandal to draw attention to yourself. You know all of that, and you came to me anyway. Why?" Catherine was quiet for a moment. "Because you deserve to know," she said simply. He stared at her. "Because you are a good man," she went on, her voice steady, though her heart was beating so hard she was sure he could see it. "And good men deserve to know the truth, even when the truth is cruel, even when telling it costs something. That is all, Mr. Harwell. There is no other reason." The summer night pressed close around them. Music drifted from the house. Leaves rustled overhead. A night bird called from the old oak beyond the wall. "I owe you a great deal, Miss Ashmore," he said at last, and though the formality remained, something beneath it had shifted. "You owe me nothing. I only told you the truth." "That is not nothing." He held her gaze, and in the charged hush between them, Catherine became painfully aware of how close they were standing. She could smell summer air on his coat, starch and cedar, and the faintest trace of brandy from the ballroom. If she lifted one hand, just one, it seemed she might touch the front of his sleeve and alter the course of her whole life by so small a thing. Then a burst of Octavia's laughter floated from the house, and his expression shuddered again. "I need to return," he said. "I have a matter to attend to before midnight." He stepped past her, then stopped. "Miss Ashmore," he said without turning, "do not leave before the end of the evening." She stayed. Near 11, she watched Edmund cross the ballroom toward Octavia with the quiet purpose of a man who had already decided. She saw him speak to her in a voice too low to hear. She saw Octavia's smile go still. She saw her glance first toward the garden, then toward Reginald. And at last she saw Octavia search the room until her gaze found Catherine standing alone near the wall. Their eyes met. Octavia's expression did not become angry. It became colder than anger, precise, calculating, the look of a woman measuring what would be required to ruin another woman thoroughly. Catherine did not look away. She was not sure where the steadiness came from. Perhaps it had always been there and she had simply never had cause to use it. But she held Octavia's gaze across the width of the brilliant, crowded room and did not retreat. When Octavia finally looked away, it felt like a small victory. Catherine understood at once that the war had only begun. The next morning, it did. Mrs. Hartwell called. Lady Bowmont had been speaking. The story moving fastest through the county was that Catherine had accosted Mr. Harwell at his own engagement ball and made scandalous accusations against Virginia's finest young woman. At the breakfast table, Dorothea was furious, James Ashmore grave, and Harriet calm enough to be dangerous. "Don't use me as a reason," Harriet said when their mother invoked her prospects. "I won't have it." An hour later, Edmund Harwell arrived at their front door. He stood in the parlor looking exactly like a man who had not slept. And God help her, Catherine's heart tightened at the sight of it. Not because he looked handsome. though he did, in the severe, exhausted way of a man held together only by will, but because he looked as she felt, wind-burned inside by the same difficult night. The sameness of that relieved her more than it should have. He told Catherine and her mother everything plainly. He had confronted Octavia. She had denied it, of course. She had also lied about Catherine approaching her earlier in the evening. But Edmund knew where Catherine had been standing. He noticed more than people thought he did. Then he said the words that changed the room. "I've ended the engagement." He had sent word that morning. The match was dissolved. And because Octavia had already begun moving against Catherine's reputation, he meant to make public his belief in her account. He proposed attending the Whitfield reception with Catherine as his guest, visibly and immediately, so that no one could claim she had spoken without his full confidence. "Why would you do that?" Catherine asked. "Because it seems like the honest thing to do," he said. That word again. Honest. He used it the way she did, not as a performance, but as a minimum standard. She told him she would think on it. By Thursday morning, an unsigned letter had arrived warning Catherine to correct her account and consider Harriet's future. She read it twice, folded it with perfect precision, and then wrote Edmund a short note of her own. "I'll be ready at 7. He arrived precisely at 7, and she stepped out in the blue dress her mother had pressed. Something moved across his face when he saw her, brief, unguarded, and hot enough that Catherine felt it under her skin before he drew it carefully back into control. In the carriage to Whitfield, Edmund told her that the threatening letter had not gone only to her. 2 other women who had been near the corridor that evening had received similar warnings. One had already come to him. "You were not the only witness, Catherine," he said quietly. "You were simply the only one who came forward." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. The sound of it in his mouth fell between them like a stone into still water, ripples widening long after the word itself was gone. The Whitfield reception was enormous. Every face turned toward them within moments of their arrival. Octavia, luminous in ivory, intercepted them near the entrance with the perfectly calibrated composure of a wronged angel. "I do hope you're feeling well, Miss Ashmore," she said softly. "It must have been such a difficult week." "All the talk." "They do say such unkind things," Catherine replied pleasantly. "Though I have found that what people say tends to reflect more on the speaker than the subject." For 2 hours, the battle was fought in polished sentences, pauses, glances, and seating arrangements. Catherine discovered that a woman with nothing left to protect was often the most dangerous person in the room.
And Edmund was there. Not constantly at her side, that would have been theater. Worse, it would have looked like pity, but unmistakably there. When conversation turned sharp, he appeared.
When one woman turned from Catherine to speak to someone more profitable, Edmund redirected the question back to Catherine as though it had always belonged there. When laughter sharpened toward mockery, his presence alone cooled it. She noticed every time. Every single time. And each time, something inside her loosened a little more, as though a knot she had lived with for so long, she no longer felt it had finally begun to give way. When gossip touched Harriet, Catherine stopped it cleanly. "My sister has done nothing," she said to Mrs. Pratt in a voice so even it carried farther than raised volume would have. "Whatever grievance Lady Beaumont's family holds, it is with me. Directing it at Harriet is not justice. It is cowardice." Mrs. Judge Carey, who had heard enough, stepped in at once. "I quite agree." That moment changed the current of the room. Later that same evening came the second blow. Octavia, accompanied by a deeply uncomfortable business associate named Philip Dorsey, revealed that James Ashmore had entered into a lending arrangement with her father's firm 3 years earlier, one containing a clause allowing accelerated repayment if relations between the families were damaged. Catherine felt the floor tilt beneath her. Her father's property, their home, the eastern roadland that had been in the family for decades. Octavia had found the pressure point, but this time the threat landed with more than malice behind it. The clause had not been drafted by accident. The timing was not improvisation. Bowmont money, social retaliation, and Octavia's household attack all belonged to the same machinery. That was the ugly elegance of it. They did not merely punish defiance after the fact. They built systems that made defiance too expensive to attempt. Edmund understood that almost at once. He turned on Dorsey with a stillness more frightening than anger. "Has the provision been invoked?" he asked. "Not yet, sir." "Then it won't be." He made it clear, in a tone quiet enough to chill the blood, that he was among the larger investors connected to the firm, and that his position would be understood by every relevant party before the week ended. Then, turning fully to Octavia, he said the thing Catherine would carry home all night like a live ember. When she asked why he was doing any of it, he first answered, "Because it is the right thing to do." Then, when she told him that was not all of it, something in his face opened, just slightly. "No," he said, "it isn't." That same night, a letter from her father's solicitor confirmed the danger. James Ashmore had mortgaged the eastern property 3 years before to cover losses from a failed venture. Beaumont's firm was reviewing the terms. If the accelerated clause were invoked, the family could lose the house. "How long do we have?" Catherine asked. "Perhaps 2 weeks before a formal decision," her father said. 30 days after that, if they call it." Catherine looked at the letter, then at her father's face, suddenly older than it had seemed the day before. "I am terrified," she said honestly. "But fear and action are not the same thing. Give me until morning." She did not sleep. By 7, she had decided. By 8, she had written to Edmund Harwell. By 9, she had sent Thomas with the letter before she could think herself out of it. Harriet found her at breakfast, staring into untouched tea. Catherine told her everything, the lending arrangement, the clause, the numbers, and then she confessed that she had written to Edmund, not to ask him for rescue, but to release him from a promise he had made without knowing the full scope of the danger. Harriet listened, and then said, with the clarity that often made her seem older than either of them, "What is right is letting people decide for themselves what they want to stand for. You keep making decisions on his behalf. That is not honesty. That is its own kind of control." Edmund arrived within the hour. This time, Catherine told him the full extent of the situation. He listened without interruption, fully present, and then laid out the problem as he saw it. There were 3 investors who mattered. Dorsey would not push the clause. A man named Hatfield in Richmond probably would not involve himself in county politics. The third was Bowmont himself. Then Edmund said something Catherine had not expected. Bowmont had more to lose from a public dispute over his firm using lending arrangements to punish inconvenient women than he had to gain from one recovered debt. "There are people in this state," Edmund said, "with ink and printing presses and considerably less patience for this sort of thing than the average drawing room. I know 3 of them personally." "You would go to the press?" Catherine asked. "I would speak to colleagues who happen to have relationships with the press," he said with careful precision. "And I would make certain it was well understood why the story existed in the first place. It would be a great fight," she told him. "Bowmont had more resources than he did." "Perhaps," Edmund said. "But in 12 years of business, I have learned that the one currency Bowmont cannot replace is his reputation for being a fair dealer. The moment that is questioned, his firm loses half its value." Then he looked at her with a directness she had come to recognize as entirely his own. "Catherine, I need you to stop presenting me with opportunities to walk away. I'm not going to take them." "Why not?" she asked, though her heart was anything but steady. This time he did not answer quickly. He stood at the window a moment, hands braced behind his back, like a man deciding whether truth once spoken could ever be gathered up again. "Because I spent 2 years engaged to a woman I knew, in some buried part of my mind, was not what she presented herself to be. I kept that part of my mind quiet because it was convenient, because she was beautiful, and because the right questions were uncomfortable." His voice did not rise. That made it hurt more. "I buried doubt because desire is a coward when it suits itself," he said. "And then, when you came to me in that ballroom, I nearly did the same thing again. I nearly thanked you politely and returned to the life expected of me. If you had not stayed, if you had not stood where I could come back to you, I might have gone on with it one day longer, perhaps more." He lifted his eyes to hers. "I am ashamed of how close I came to choosing comfort over truth, and I do not think I shall forgive myself easily for the pain that would have cost me, or cost you, if I had." Catherine had not expected guilt from him to feel like intimacy, but it did. He took one breath and went on. "And then a woman I had never met walked across a ballroom full of people who would have mocked her for it, and told me the truth anyway, at cost to herself, with nothing to gain. That kind of person does not come along often. I would be a fool to keep looking for reasons to walk away from one." Catherine looked down at her hands. She needed a moment, just a moment, to absorb it without her face betraying everything it was doing. "All right," she said at last. "To what?" "To all of it." The next 4 days were among the longest and strangest of Catherine's life. Edmund moved quickly. Underneath his stillness, she discovered, lived a man who, once decided, did not linger. He was in Richmond by the following morning to speak with Hatfield, who, as predicted, declined to involve himself in a family quarrel dressed up as business. That made 2 of the 3. Bowmont was the variable. And Bowmont, it turned out, was watching to see what would happen next before committing himself. "That is actually favorable," Edmund told Catherine when he returned. "A man who means to move moves quickly. A man who is calculating the costs waits." While he waited, the county talked, and the story shifted. Catherine felt it the way one feels weather changing, in the pressure of a room, the quality of a glance, the sudden willingness of certain women to call. Mrs. Whitfield stayed for tea and made her position clear without naming it. On the 3rd day, Harriet received another call from Thomas Everett. On the 4th came a brief letter from Mr. Graves. The lending firm had reviewed the Ashmore account, the existing terms remained satisfactory, no action would be taken on the accelerated provision, and the matter was considered resolved. At breakfast, James Ashmore read the letter, folded it, and after a long silence told his eldest daughter, "I owe you an apology." He had been wrong, he said, not only about the outcome, about her. That struck Catherine more deeply than she expected. For 28 years, she had been the quiet daughter, the unremarkable one, the one who stood near walls and tried not to take up space. And now her father looked at her as though seeing her for the first time. "It could have gone the other way," she said carefully. "But it didn't," he answered. No, it did not. He asked to thank Edmund properly. Catherine wrote at once, and Edmund's response arrived the following morning faster than the post should have allowed, which meant it had been hand-delivered. He would call Friday afternoon, he wrote, and he hoped she would be home. She was. He spent half an hour with James in the study while Catherine sat in the parlor pretending to read and failing entirely. Harriet sat opposite, pretending not to notice, which was its own kindness. When Edmund emerged, James had the look of a man who had set down something he had been carrying for a long time. He excused himself, transparently and politely, and disappeared upstairs. Catherine and Edmund were alone. "He is a good man," Edmund said of her father. "He is. He blames himself for putting your family in a position Beaumont could use. He does. I told him he ought to blame Beaumont for being the kind of man who uses it." That seemed to strike Edmund as a reasonable distinction. At last, Catherine asked what he had said to Beaumont's people to make them back down. He looked at her with something like the beginning of amusement. "I made it clear that I was prepared to become considerably more trouble than the debt was worth. And I made it clear that I intended to remain present in your family's affairs for the foreseeable future." It was that phrase that moved through her like light under a door. "The foreseeable future," she repeated. "Yes. You should be careful what you promise people, Mr. Harwell." He leaned forward just slightly. "And you," he said with that same direct, unhurried certainty, "should be careful about telling people what they ought to feel. I know what I said. I meant every word of it then, and I mean it now. If you give me the chance, I intend to go on meaning it for a very long time." The afternoon light lay across the carpet. The clock on the mantel ticked. Somewhere down the hall, Harriet was humming faintly. Catherine had spent 28 years trying not to be seen. She had been seen 10 days ago, and the world had not ended. It had cracked open instead. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, looking at this serious, honest, entirely unexpected man, "you ought to stay for supper." His expression changed in a way she had never seen before. It did not merely ease, it opened. "I'd like that very much," he said. Supper that evening was the strangest and most comfortable meal Catherine could remember. Edmund stayed 3 hours. James laughed twice in earnest. Dorothea refilled Edmund's glass with an ease that had entirely replaced the strategic stiffness of the previous weeks. Harriet asked him 3 questions that would have been impertinent from anyone else, and he answered all 3 without flinching. Catherine mostly listened. That was her nature, and she had long since stopped apologizing for it. But she noticed everything: the way Edmund spoke to her father as an equal, the way he answered Harriet plainly, the way every so often he looked at Catherine with that same quiet attention, as though checking she was still there, and was glad each time that she was. When he left, he said his goodbyes correctly to her parents and to Harriet. Then he looked at Catherine and said, low enough that only she could hear, "Thank you for staying that night at the Ashworth ball." She had replayed that night so many times its edges had gone smooth, but hearing him say it, hearing the weight he placed on it like a man acknowledging a debt he meant to carry honestly, undid something in her chest. "Thank you for listening," she replied. His gaze held hers 1 heartbeat longer than was proper. It was a small thing. It did not feel small. He nodded, put on his hat, and walked down the path to his carriage. The moment the door closed, Dorothea appeared at Catherine's shoulder. "Well," her mother said, "Mama, I am not going to say anything. You are going to say a great deal." Dorothea was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. "He is a good man," she said at last. And beneath all the ambition and calculation, Catherine heard something rawer and truer than she ever expected to hear from her mother. "I was wrong to doubt it." "Yes," Catherine said softly. "He is." 3 days later, Octavia Bowmont left for Richmond. That same day, a letter arrived from Margaret Forsyth, one of the women who had been near the corridor that night and had received her own unsigned threat. She apologized for her silence and wrote with the plain honesty that Catherine found herself admiring at once. Catherine answered warmly. Harriet received an official call from Thomas Everett and, after it ended, announced with serene certainty that she thought she was going to marry him. Edmund called on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and then the following Monday. The calls were proper, entirely above reproach, and yet unmistakably more than propriety. He showed up consistently, without drama, without performance, simply being present in the same room as a woman he had decided mattered. Catherine matched him in this. She stopped preparing speeches. She stopped bracing herself for the conversation that would reveal everything to have meant less than it seemed. She argued with him about land law. She laughed when he said something dry and self-aware about his own mistakes. She let herself be known. It was the thing that had always terrified her most. On the fourth call, he brought a book. On the fifth, she challenged a passage in it. He returned 2 days later with another volume, addressing the same question from a different angle. That was the afternoon Catherine understood with clean and disorienting clarity that she was not merely grateful to this man. She was falling in love with him. And because life had an appetite for irony, she understood it just as she also began to understand the shape of his absence. The days between his calls stretched. Rooms felt altered after he left them. She began to know the weight of his quiet before she heard him speak, the sound of his step on the porch, the way her own body changed when he entered a room and fixed the air in it merely by being there. She said nothing, not even to Harriet. Then Reginald Lockxley spoiled the peace. Edmund arrived unexpectedly one afternoon, looking determined in the way he did when moving toward rather than away from a battle. "Reginald Lockxley is in Richmond," he said. He had been speaking, Edmund explained, telling business associates that Catherine had fabricated everything, that she had manufactured the incident to draw Edmund's attention. 2 business associations had already suggested postponing meetings. A man Edmund had worked with for 6 years had refused his call. "It is not catastrophic," Edmund said, "but it is deliberate, and it will worsen if it is not addressed." Catherine's first instinct was immediate and terrible. "He is hurting you through me," she said. "Then you need to distance yourself." "Do not finish that sentence," Edmund said, very quietly and very firmly. Then he reminded her of something she should already have understood. "I told you 2 weeks ago that I was not going to leave you to manage this alone. I told you that was not a social courtesy. I told you it was a commitment. I do not revise my commitments when they become inconvenient. That is not a principle if it only holds when the weather is good." He would go to Richmond the next morning. He would find Lockxley, address what was being said directly and publicly, and make it clear that any man repeating Reginald's version was choosing Reginald's word over his own. Then he said the thing Catherine felt all the way to her bones. "When I return," he said, "I want to speak with your father." "About what?" she asked, though she knew. "About you. About us. About the fact that I have been in this house 11 times in 3 weeks and intend to come back indefinitely. I want to do this properly, Catherine. You deserve properly." She had spent 28 years invisible, overlooked, half erased by rooms that found her too plain to register. And now this man stood in her father's study telling her that she deserved properly, with the absolute certainty of someone who had thought it through and would not revise his conclusion. "All right," she said. "To what?" "To all of it." He left the next morning and was gone 4 days. They were the longest 4 days since the week of the Ashworth ball. Catherine filled them with purpose, lending papers, a visit to Margaret Forsyth, and helping Harriet prepare for Thomas Everett's first official call, which went so well that Harriet came to Catherine's room afterward, sat on the bed in complete silence for a full minute, and then announced serenely, "I think I am going to marry that man." Edmund's letter arrived on the 3rd day. It was brief. Lockxley had been found. The conversation had been direct and unambiguous. 3 of the Richmond men Edmund had worried about had already reversed themselves. He would be home by Friday. And then, at the end, in slightly less formal handwriting, he added, "I find I have more to say to you than can be put in a letter. I hope Friday is not too long to wait." Catherine read that last line 4 times before folding the letter and putting it in the drawer where she kept the things that mattered. He arrived Friday afternoon and went first to her father. She knew what was happening. She could hear the low murmur of voices in the study, her father's measured tone, Edmund's even one, Harriet's conspicuously pointed absence from the room. After half an hour, James Ashmore came to the parlor doorway and looked at Catherine with that same expression of revised scene he had worn the morning after the solicitor's letter. "Edmund would like to speak with you," he said. "I know." Her father smiled, a small, private smile not meant for company. "He is a good man," he said again, but this time it sounded like a blessing. Edmund stood by the study window when she entered. He turned and looked at her the way he always had at the moments that mattered, not through her, not past her, but directly and completely at her. "Your father said yes," he said. "I assumed he would." "You assumed correctly." Then he came 2 steps closer. "I want to ask you myself, not as a formality, as an honest question between 2 people who have been honest with each other from the beginning." He stopped within arm's reach. "Will you marry me, Catherine?" No performance, no ornamental speech about beauty or virtue or social convenience. Just a direct question from a direct man who had shown her, in 11 calls and 2 public battles and 1 letter from Richmond, exactly who he was. And yet that simplicity was precisely what undid her, because by then she knew what it had cost him to get here. The guilt of almost marrying the wrong woman. The humiliation of having wanted beauty more than truth. The sleepless nights, the Richmond fight, the plain fact that he had kept coming back to her not once, but again and again, as though each return made something inside him clearer. She looked at him. At the man who had listened when he had no reason to trust her, who had stood beside her when she had no claim on his loyalty, who had come back every single time, who, even now, looked less like a gentleman staging a proposal than like a man placing his whole future into her hands and asking her not to break it. "Yes," she said. He exhaled one slow, quiet breath, like a man setting down a weight he had carried all the way from Virginia to Richmond and back. "Good," he said. And then, because he was who he was, "That is genuinely, enormously good." Catherine laughed, a surprised, real laugh, the best she had had in 28 years. He stepped forward and took both her hands in his and held them the way he held everything, with care, with full attention, and with the certainty of a man who knew precisely what he was receiving. Their engagement was announced the following week. The county received it with the varied enthusiasm of a community that had watched the entire story unfold and, in the end, mostly decided which side it wished to be found upon. Mrs. Judge Carey sent a note that said simply, "Exactly right." Mrs. Whitfield called and stayed for tea. Margaret Forsyth wrote again. Octavia Bowmont from Richmond said nothing at all, and Catherine thought with mild surprise that silence was the most honest thing the woman had ever offered. James Ashmore paid off the remaining balance on the restructured lending arrangement. On the morning the last payment cleared, he came down to breakfast looking 10 years younger. Harriet received a second call from Thomas Everett, and then a third. By October, she wore a small garnet ring and the expression of a woman who had located exactly the life she meant to have. Catherine married Edmund Harwell on a Saturday in late October in the small church on the county road where her parents had married and her grandparents before them. Harriet stood beside her. Her father's hand was steady on her arm. At the end of the aisle waited the whole of a life she had never expected. But if the proposal had been quiet, the wedding gave her something larger. Not spectacle, claiming. As she entered the church, Catherine saw every face turn toward her, many of them the same faces that had once measured her as too plain to matter, too quiet to fear, too easily dismissed to remember. And there, before all of them, stood Edmund Harwell with his gaze fixed on her alone, not politely, not decorously, but with such naked and disciplined joy that her breath caught. He looked like a man who had almost lost the right thing once and knew it. When James placed her hand in Edmund's fingers closed around hers with a steadiness that felt almost reverent. The vows were spoken. The church held its breath. And when he kissed her at last, it was not the reckless, devouring kind that belonged to cheaper stories. It was worse in the way that only clean things can be worse. Deep, controlled, intimate, and so full of withheld hunger that Catherine felt the force of it in her knees. The old bell outside began to ring. Somewhere, Harriet made a sound that might have been crying and then tried to disguise it as laughter. Later, much later, when the reception had thinned and the October night lay cool beyond the windows, Edmund found Catherine briefly alone near the side steps of the church hall, her veil loosened, candlelight touching the pearls at her throat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them had changed so much from the first silence in that garden. Then, it had held danger, gratitude, and things neither of them could afford to name. Now, it held possession of a gentler kind. Permission. Relief. The ache of finally reaching what both of them had been walking toward long before either dared say so. "You are thinking too hard on your wedding night," Edmund said softly. She smiled without looking at him. "It seems to be a habit." "What are you thinking?" Catherine turned then, and because this was the first night in her life when she had nothing left to hide, she answered honestly. "That I spent years trying not to be seen," she said. And it turns out being seen by the right person changes the whole shape of the world. Something moved in his face, something so tender it nearly hurt her to witness it. He stepped closer, not enough to scandalize a servant if one looked out a window, enough that she could feel his warmth in the cool night. "Yes," he said, "it does." Then, after a pause that felt deliberate and dangerously intimate, he added, "And if I have my way, Catherine Harwell, you will never spend another day of your life wondering whether you are wanted." Wanted. No one had ever given her that word before, as though it were both a confession and a vow. She looked up at him and saw, beneath all his discipline, the hunger he had kept honorable for so long, the longing, the gratitude, the guilt that had not vanished entirely, only transformed into care, the love. For one suspended second, she understood that her life had not changed the night she overheard Octavia. It had changed the moment Edmund came back to the garden and asked her to tell him everything again. Outside, Virginia lay hushed beneath the first real coolness of autumn. Inside, Catherine Ashmore, no longer near the wall, no longer overlooked, no longer alone, stood in her husband's gaze and felt, with all the certainty she had once spent on endurance, what it meant at last to be chosen.